Now I'd like to welcome to the front Mr. Mark Radtke from Integrys. He's going to talk about some fueling station considerations, and it plays right down on the last question about fueling stations. So, Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks, Jeff, for opening up, opening up this presentation, sharing your experience with compressed natural gas in the heavy-duty trucking industry. So I'm from Integrys Energy Group. If you're from this area, you probably know Integrys best as Wisconsin Public Service or WPS. Integrys is the holding company, and we have a handful of utilities in the upper Midwest, like WPS, in our family of companies. We also have an energy marketing business that moves energy to customers throughout the northeast quarter of the U.S. And our most recent addition is to the family of companies is the compressed natural gas business. Earlier this year, we concluded that CNG made more sense than ever before. And in looking into why it wasn't getting traction more quickly, we concluded that we could perhaps play a role in helping facilitate the build-out and adoption of compressed natural gas, not as an alternate fuel, but as a mainstream fuel. I mean, it's the economics associated with it, the attractiveness of the fuel. It doesn't. I don't believe it belongs or deserves the alternate moniker. It is very much a mainstream fuel that stands on its own. And as a result of early stages building out that business, we identified an acquisition opportunity. We acquired two companies, Trillium USA and Pinnacle CNG, that bring us expertise from having been in the business for 20 years, serving primarily the municipal transit segment, so city buses, that type of thing, which is actually a fairly mature market for compressed natural gas. That has been, I'd characterize it, an early adopter of CNG, and it's actually a great application for compressed natural gas. And then Pinnacle has equipment manufacturing capability, so building the compressor systems that actually make the natural gas for being distributed. So bringing that organization into our company brings with it the experience of having been involved at 80 CNG stations around the country. You'll note the heavy presence in the state of California. There's a lot of CNG deployed there, well beyond the municipal transit space. Taxi cabs are frequent adopters, as well as even light passenger vehicles. In California, you can a single passenger vehicle can run in the HOV lane if they're CNG fueled, and so there are people that buy it just for that. I do want to point out, though, that when we looked at this industry, we really think that it's the heavy trucking segment that is poised to really take off. The economics for light passenger are a bit more challenging than they are for light passenger. So let's take a look at, as Jeff said, an understanding of the costs of CNG. And I'd like to run through this for two reasons. One is to help us all understand what's actually, what the cost components of natural gas are versus diesel, but it also helps to illustrate and create a little better understanding of what are the different steps involved and what's the process associated with creating natural gas or compressing natural gas so that it's acceptable as a transportation fuel. Jeff had mentioned that if you go out to the CNG Now website, you can see the price of CNG posted at various stations around the country, and you'll see some stations sell in the $1 per gallon equivalent range. And if you look just at the cost of the commodity itself, so natural gas itself, and the cost to deliver that commodity to the distribution point. So it's trying to get this on an apples-to-apples basis with diesel at a particular truck stop. In the case of diesel, the vast majority of the cost of the product is the underlying number 2 fuel oil. And then you've got a little bit of, so basis is just, that's a locational price difference. It varies by region of the country. Has to do with supply and demand, pipeline delivery infrastructure, and then the delivery component is actually that local delivery component to actually get it to the station distribution point. And it's a very different picture than with natural gas. Natural gas, the commodity itself, is it translates about 63 cents at today's market prices. If you were looking on like one of the news channels, you might see that natural gas is trading for about $3. I think today it's about $3.65, $3.70, and MMBTU. Those are the units that natural gas is transacted in the gas industry. But you can get about 7 or 8 gallons, diesel gallon equivalent, out of a unit of natural gas. So that's why it translates to just 63 cents of fuel. You then have a little bit of basis differential to get it from the Gulf Coast where natural gas is priced to a region. I chose the Wisconsin region since we're a Wisconsin market here, and then the final delivery component is what the utility charges to actually deliver it to your premise, whether it's the location of your fleet or a public fueling location. So that 83 cents is the cost of the delivered commodity itself. Looks like a pretty attractive value proposition, right? But wait, there's more. In order to make compressed natural gas, you need to run that natural gas through compressors. A lot like an air compressor would be that you might have at your home or business, typically a reciprocating cylinder-driven compressor. And there is not an insignificant amount of electricity required to produce a gallon equivalent of CNG, on the order of a kilowatt hour. So looking at average electric rates in this market, that translates to 12 or 13 cents. And I want to emphasize that these numbers are for illustration purposes, but they're based on prices that I saw on the day that I put the slide together. My diesel price is actually quite old. My CNG price is a little bit more current. So that gets you up, still pretty attractive, a little bit under $1. And so, all right. That's a good deal. Sign me up, right? But again, there is more to that equation. I included a nickel of site cost. This is essentially, if you think about at a truck stop or a fueling location, there's going to be a margin that's made at that station. I don't know what that number is. It depends, who you talk to. It could be a couple pennies, could be a dime. So I just kind of averaged it, but held it constant at the 2. So this is essentially the cost to have people operating at a fueling location. So we're still, the relationship holds together. Okay, now here's an item that is unique to compressed natural gas: station operation and maintenance. I mentioned the compressors that are required to create to make CNG, to take the natural gas from the utility distribution system and pressurize it so that it's at the appropriate 3,600 psi for a vehicle. There's significant rotating equipment in those compressor stations that needs to be maintained. The cost estimates that you see for station maintenance vary widely. It's a function of the underlying equipment that you have in the first place. So essentially how much inherent maintenance is required based on the design of the systems. But it is also very much driven by the amount of volume that is moved through the particular station. Some of the costs in station O&M are directly attributable to each gallon that flows through the station. But there are some fixed costs associated with periodic. They're more time-based, oil changes, filter changes, that type of a thing. So we see station O&M costs vary considerably, anywhere from 25 cents to maybe 50 cents a gallon equivalent. So I just, for purposes of this illustration, chose a 33-cent number. Still looks pretty attractive. But there's one other thing to consider. If you're building or buying a CNG station, the dollars that you plunk down to buy that equipment, presumably you can't just forget about those costs. I mean, that's typically not a healthy business practice. So if we look at the costs of the initial, the capital equipment, and spread that over the number of gallons that are anticipated to be delivered through that station over the life, you get what I refer to as a capital recovery or a depreciation cost. This number, so I plugged in 60 cents here. This number varies wildly with station size. The larger the station gets, the more volume that is moved through a station, the smaller this number gets. There is very much economies of scale in compressed natural gas stations. In fact, for example, there are home fueling stations that are available for light passenger use, and the capital recovery cost on those stations can be double or triple this type of a number, simply because they just don't benefit from the economies of scale that you do at a commercial scale, the scale of station that those of us in this room, I think, most are thinking about. So still, you can see a pretty attractive value proposition. I tacked onto this slide taxes, which I held consistent between CNG and diesel. It's not necessarily the case. Actually, right now, there is a federal excise tax credit of 50 cents to the benefit of compressed natural gas. This slide doesn't show that. I'm assuming, I'm just taking the Wisconsin federal and state rate today. There are also some states will have state tax credit for CNG or tax exempt CNG altogether. I really put that on the slide just to make sure that we're giving some consideration to the tax aspect. I mean, it can create a differential. I don't necessarily advocate for that. I don't think this fuel needs a fuel tax subsidy, if you will. The economics stand on their own, but that subsidy does exist at certain times and in certain states. So I wanted to illustrate it for full disclosure. So that gets us to a delivered pump price of $2.45 for CNG or $3.59 for diesel. Now, Jeff mentioned earlier that diesel in Green Bay is about $4. And so I put this slide together back in the September timeframe. Since that time, the price of natural gas has come down a bit, and the price of crude oil, and thus diesel, has risen pretty dramatically. One of the reasons that I didn't update this slide was to illustrate that, but I want to be really clear that when the price of natural gas changes, CNG doesn't change that much, and that's more intuitive. If you look at the price stack on this slide, it's that bottom component, that original 63 cents that I talked about, is largely the only price component that's affected by natural gas. So if the cost of natural gas doubled tomorrow, it wouldn't be a happy day from a CNG perspective, but the price of CNG doesn't double with the price of natural gas. So you get some natural stabilizing of your fuel costs with CNG versus diesel. If the price of crude oil doubles, I mean, what we're looking at just an unbelievable price for diesel. So I think those were the points that I wanted to make around pricing. Let me pause there and just ask: are there any questions relative to this? Yes.
O&M and capital recovery, you don't have anything for diesel product. Is that over and above what you would consider O&M and recovery on the diesel product?
Yeah, the reason that I didn't have capital and O&M in my diesel price is because I was pegging to a public pump price of diesel, and so that's actually all rolled in. That I had basis and delivery, and so any of those other cost components, I'm assuming that they are recovered in that. It would be the red layer of the diesel price stack. You know, I'm not an expert in that particular fuel and the economics around diesel fueling stations, but I know what they're selling for, and so if I understand the tax component and the commodity component, then I'm just backing in. Everything else must be recovered in that delivery and basis component. So that's kind of my shorthand for that. I apologize for that. Question over here.
Let's assume that the demand, if this becomes an everyday fuel used by trucks far and wide, what do you think could happen to the price of CNG that draws supply and demand kick in, commodity pricing that's taking place right now with crude oil and diesel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if everybody switched to CNG, what happens? Today we've got just an extraordinary abundance of natural gas in the U.S. And it really is a U.S. issue. Natural gas is not an international commodity like crude oil is, because it's not so easy to transport great distances. I mean, they liquefy it, put it on tankers, move it to other countries. So that does happen, but it's a fairly costly process, and other countries actually have access to much lower cost natural gas than we do. So if there's a market that needs natural gas, it would make more sense for that natural gas to come from like Trinidad or something like that rather than the U.S. So I look at natural gas as a North American fuel, and the size of the North American natural gas market on an annual basis. The U.S. consumes about 24 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So let's not get hung up on how much a trillion cubic foot is. It's a lot, and we consume 24 of those a year. My understanding is heavy-duty trucks consume about 22 billion gallons per year. If all of that was converted to natural gas, that would consume an additional about 9 TCF, 9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So we would see the market go from, say, 23 TCF of consumption up to 31 TCF. If we wanted to explore this in a lot of depth, I've got in my appendix some slides around supply and demand. The year's worth of proven reserves that we have out there in the U.S. would suggest that the supply community, producers, can adequately reach the reserves that we know where they are, and they are technically producible today to be able to respond to that market increase. That said, I think it would be naive to suggest that natural gas is always going to stay at the price it's at today. I mean, being in the business a long time, it just feels like a really low price to me. And I would be nervous about that if the value proposition, when we look at that price stack, if the value proposition was all based on the cost of natural gas, then I'd say, hey, you know what, we have a significant natural gas price risk here. We do have some price risk associated with natural gas, I'll give you that. But again, if the price of natural gas doubled, you know, the price of CNG would go up 63 cents. It would still have, in my example, it would still have a cost advantage to diesel. And then you look at what are global projections for crude oil consumption. You know, even though we're at $100 a barrel for crude or thereabouts today, most people are suggesting there's a lot more upside potential to crude oil than downside potential. So when I weigh those, I think the price risk associated with natural gas, in my mind, is a better bet than the price risk associated with petroleum products. That's just my personal opinion. Yes?
What percent capacity of EPS plan for infrastructure, and what would it take if this takes off to overload that?
Oh yeah. So in terms of infrastructure capacity, in all honesty, I couldn't tell you what the capacity is. I mean, on most days, the WPS infrastructure is very underutilized. I mean, we designed for like a 20-year historic cold, you know. So on those coldest days, the system gets taxed, but it is designed to operate at historic low temperatures. It's actually not terribly difficult to increase the capacity of natural gas infrastructure. You can increase the amount of compression, so you're essentially just moving more natural gas through the existing pipes or laying additional pipe in. I mean, at the end of the day, I know that it seems like, wow, we're placing a lot of demand on this natural gas system. I'll be honest with you, from somebody that comes from the industry, the thing that's amazing to me about CNG is how little natural gas it actually takes. When we looked at, from a business plan perspective, what kind of opportunities are there around optimizing the supply side of the natural gas supply side to a station? Yeah, there's some interesting things. That's not the big. This is not like a power plant. I mean, power plants are huge consumers of natural gas. CNG stations, they're small consumers of natural gas. I mean, it's been compared to like a Chili's restaurant is the equivalent of what a CNG station adds to the system. I did the math a couple of days ago. I think it's like 15 homes is the equivalent of when we look at a mid-size commercial station, kind of what we'd characterize as the minimum economic scale. It's the equivalent of 15 households. So it's just not a tremendous amount of natural gas. All right, let me, yes, question, Jim. Yeah, so the capital spend on different sizes of units, it depends very much on the overall scale and the capability that you want at that station. The equipment itself, so the compression equipment itself, for an economic scale commercial station begins at like $400,000. Then you start adding balance of plant, dispenser stations, canopies, that type of a thing. Realistically, you can get to $1 million pretty quick in building out a commercial station. There are, if your requirements are less demanding than that, there are certainly lower cost, lower capital outlay options, and we can talk about that a second when we talk about the different time fill versus fast fill. All right, let me proceed then to the fueling options. So we've heard reference to time fill stations or fast fill stations. Let's run through those very briefly and talk through some of the considerations. Time fill is used for these return to base operation or return to base fleets where the vehicle is idled for a significant amount of time. Actually, the longer the vehicle is not being used, the better application that time fill is. And essentially the way it works is you have these time fill posts. So the driver pulls the vehicle into the parking stall, hooks up the hose, and walks away for the night. The system then slowly fills that vehicle overnight. And time fill systems are almost always privately owned. I mean, you build your own time fill system. It's very, very unusual to have a shared time fill system. Logistically, that just typically doesn't work out. Fast fill station is the conventional fueling experience. It is a more challenging environment to meet from an equipment standpoint. So we need to work to optimize the system design, the compression design. We put in place the intelligence to do temperature compensation so that the vehicle is getting a full fill under all temperature conditions. And we design fast fill systems for scalability and optimum asset utilization. You don't want to invest, $750,000 in a time fill station if you only need that capability 5 years out when you get your fleet growing to a larger size. So these are the two broad categories, and let's just flip through quickly and talk about some of the considerations. First of all, with time fill, start there, because that is really the time-tested approach for compressed natural gas. CNG has been around for a long time. Utilities, Wisconsin Public Service actually put a big push on this in the 80s, and all of those applications were time fill applications, school buses, that type of thing. It's fairly straightforward to design a time fill system. Not necessarily making it easy to work over the long haul, but in order to design it, the way you need to think about that is, you look on the equipment side, what is the flow rate, the capability of the system, how much CNG can it produce in an hour or a minute, or however you want to characterize it. For time fills, I think of it in terms of hours. And then what is my fueling window? So think about your operations. Do I have 12 hours to fuel my vehicles? Do I have 10 hours? Maybe do I have only 8 hours? The longer the fueling window, the better. And if you think about that, because when you're not fueling, the investment that you made in your time fill system is going unutilized in those hours when you're not fueling. So the more hours that you can be fueling on a system, the better asset utilization, the better use of that investment that you're making. And then then you look at your fueling window. That gives you the number of gallons that you can produce on a daily basis. And then it's important to think about how many days a year do you fuel? Are you a 7-day-a-week operation, or a 5? What about being down for holidays? And it's important then to calculate an annual fuel capability, because in order to do the analysis, I think you need to take everything back to the cents per gallon or dollars per gallon, as the case is. Looking at your vehicle needs, again, they're pretty straightforward. The number of vehicles that you have in your fleet and the average fuel needed per vehicle, that gets you your daily fuel need, which obviously needs to match with the daily capabilities of your system. So that station, the station and vehicle volume match delivers best economics on a time fill. Some things you need to think about. You can think in terms of averages when it comes to evaluating your costs, but averages don't work too well when it comes to evaluating what are the absolute needs of the station. The daily needs of every one of your vehicles must be met. So on a day when you need to think about what is your highest fuel usage day, and size the system to be able to accommodate that. Again, my comment earlier that your annual volume determines your annual cost, and the importance of evaluating it on a dollar per gallon equivalent, because that's the world that we live in. We compare it to diesel that we could buy down the street or in our fueling yards. So some of the considerations are our vehicle needs predictable? Not just in terms of the amount of fuel, but also the time in which they return to base, and do you ever get do you get call-outs where you need to pull a vehicle out of the yard before it might be refueled? And if that's the case, perhaps you need some fast fill capability to be added on to the time fill system. That can be engineered, and you start to inch your way towards fast fill capability. Consider, will your vehicle counts change? So if you size a system for 10 vehicles and you love it, and you want to go to 13 vehicles, can your system accommodate that? Or what is that next increment of expansion necessary to be able to meet the fueling needs of your entire fleet? What about equipment redundancy? If you have one compressor station providing your entire fleet's fuel needs, what happens if that's down? You may be able to mitigate that through a service agreement from a supplier, a guaranteed, like a 2-hour response requirement, that type of a thing. Or you could build some redundancy into a station, or perhaps there's a public station that you might have access to nearby. But you need to consider the redundancy or the availability. Think about the space that's required for time fill posts. Typically those are outdoors. If you're thinking about them being indoors, that layers in a new dimension of complexity around having proper ventilation and methane detection within a building, explosion-proof lighting, things like that. The other thing to note is that typically time fill systems are not metered at each post, so you lose the ability to track fuel usage by vehicle. So if that's something that's important to you, you can fix that by putting metering on the individual posts. It's typically not done. Adds a fair bit of expense to be able to meter at each location. Okay, then let's quickly talk about some fast fill considerations. I think the big one here is it a private? Do you want to build your own backlot fueling station, or look to a public access site? I'll be honest, the bias that we have, even though there are applications absolutely for time fill, we do a lot of time fill systems, the bias that we have is around building out public access fast fill infrastructure. We think if you're a candidate for fast fill, the best way to get the economics, the economies of scale, are to participate in public stations that have multiple fleets that are fueling at those locations. So if it's not your own backlot station, then the next thing you need to think about is location, location, location. Where are those fueling stations? What kind of a fueling network does the station operator have? Because that network is the thing that can give you reach if you're someone like Jeff that wants to take trucks beyond a single day's fueling cycle. With fast fill, you heard Jeff talk about some of the challenges that he's experienced with low fill rates at public access stations. That's one of the things that I think has been a challenge for CNG, and fortunately we know how to fix that. And fast fill stations that deliver a conventional fueling experience are available and in service today. But the easiest way to lower your cost is to kind of chintz up on the equipment that you deploy. So if you're contemplating fast fill, whether it's private or public, the thing you want to understand is, what kind of assurance can I get around fill rate? What's that maximum rate when the station is completely full? So we put storage at these locations, and it's easy for a station to demonstrate a really high fueling rate for one vehicle, but what's going to be the fueling rate for the 10th vehicle through that line? So you want to have a minimum fueling assurance as well, and consider the total time to fill. What's that assurance that the equipment provider or the station operator can give you? Because that directly impacts either driver labor or driver satisfaction if they're being paid by the mile and they're spending time waiting around at a station for a slow fill to their vehicle. A fill volume assurance, temperature compensation. So the issue here is that compressed natural gas actually comes into the vehicle at a temperature well above ambient because of the compression process. Now we run that through coolers to bring it down to levels, but you also need to then be measuring the ambient temperature. When it's warm outside, that gas sitting in those tanks is going to cool, and you'll end up with a less than full fill if it's a 90-degree day. So you want to have temperature compensation on your station so that it knows that it's 90 degrees out today, and it is safe that you can actually overfill the vehicles so that when the gas cools to the 3600 psi is at 70 degrees. When that gas cools, you'll still have a full tank. Otherwise, you hear of cases where people come away from a station saying, gee, I only got an 80% fill there. That's because of the lack of or inadequate temperature compensation. So you want to have assurances around that. And then, of course, reliability of the equipment and overall fuel quality so that you don't run into fuel-related engine problems or stations being out of service when you're depending on them. Just some general considerations that I think apply to all cases. Natural gas seems like it's everywhere, but the reality is it's not. And just because you have natural gas at your facility today doesn't mean you necessarily have an adequate volume of natural gas to be able to support fueling your fleets. So work with a service provider, or work with your utility to understand what's available. It can typically always be expanded, but there's some cost associated with that. You need to consider that. Equipment service options, what's available there. If something breaks, who's going to be taking care of it? What is the response time? That needs to be all understood and contractually provided. There are potential permitting requirements, building codes, safety codes that need to be adhered to. Work with someone that has experience in that, or make sure that you're looking into that, because that can certainly add lead time to your construction or implementation process. If you're working with public stations, you can certainly negotiate volume commitments and discounts so that as your volumes at that station grow, you'll be rewarded through a lower price, or as the overall volume at that station grows, the station gets greater economies of scale, you can participate in those savings, being a long-time contractual customer. And then there are pricing innovations that are available. You can structure prices so that you've always got a savings relative to diesel, regardless of what diesel does. Or you could fix the cost of CNG over. You might have a contract that what your profit margin is, so you want to lock in your fuel costs over a 12-month time frame or something like that. Or just float with the market, as is very often the case with diesel fuel. But those options certainly are available for natural gas as well. I'm running along here, so I won't spend time on some of the details of the way we think that stations can deliver superior performance in a public fueling environment. But let me pause there and take some questions. All right. Go on.